All right, off to the races. Again, my apologies for having to do this way, especially for Mexico. I know a few of you in class are from Mexico. I'm sure more people have ties to Mexico. I've been to Mexico several times. I like Mexico a lot. It is a country I know a bit better than some of the others that I'm tasked to talk about in this class. So it's a shame to have to do it this way, especially given that so few of you actually bother to watch this. Thanks to you, thanks to those of you who are. I do appreciate, even though I don't know who does and doesn't, but I appreciate your effort if you're paying attention now. Format's the same. Here's the map. I am going to try to wrap this up quickly, hopefully half an hour ish. So I'm going to hit the high notes. I'm going to skip over. I maybe won't address every point on the PowerPoint. But here we go. Why study this case? And again, I always, maybe this semester, I haven't stressed it as much because I haven't had to fight against the current as much as in other classes, other times I've taught this class. But I don't want you to, your mind should not immediately jump to, it's close to the United States, it has a long border with the United States, important to the United States, right? Think about this for its own merits, right? It is a real interesting case study when we think about challenges to a young democracy. I use the term young democracy because the textbook discusses Mexico as a young democracy. The text doesn't really classify Mexico as fully democratic until the year 2000. We'll talk about why that is throughout here. But there's an obvious need to establish political order. We'll come to this in a bit. I won't foreshadow now. But if you have read the chapter, you know a little bit about the party system in Mexico, and the future is uncertain. This has a lot to do with the fact, with the reason why the text doesn't classify Mexico as a democracy until a full democracy until the year 2000. It's because the 70-some years prior, the whole system was dominated by one party. And not so much in a Japan LDP sort of way, but more similar to an authoritarian regime where the state and the party were more or less fused. But anyway, we'll go into the details in a sec. Economic development, the quest for economic development, last couple of decades, save the crisis of 2008 and the years immediately after, Mexico's developed pretty well. I mean, it's been ahead of the curve compared to other similar sized economies and similarly structured economies. But over time, the country has undergone real pendulum shifts between free market policies and a more statist political economy. At present, with the current president, I'd say it's definitely more statist. But I have a feeling come next presidential election, you'll see a shift more toward the free market. But such radical shifts over time aren't necessarily the way to cultivate long-term stable economic development. So the economic development that has been achieved in recent years is in spite of this back and forth that we see. Establish transparency and rule of law. This is, I mean, when you think about the drug trade, if you watch the Ozark show, you follow the news very, very recently, just a month or two ago, some medical tourists had crossed the border. I believe there were 4 people from North Carolina. They were caught in a crossfire between rival gangs just at the border. 2 people died. We can go back to 2014, the case of the 43 disappeared students. And over time, journalists have dug around and noted that their disappearance was perhaps an orchestrated effort between or among rural politicians, police force, and cartels. That's probably the most obvious recent case of an obvious lack of transparency in the rule of law. It's an endemic problem, and those journalists who seek to try to sort out such issues, get to the bottom of them, can end up dead, right? I think the fact that Mexico is such a dangerous place for journalists is a consequence of the lack of transparency and a lack of rule of law. But anyway, we'll come back to these points throughout the chat here. And again, I'm going to try to keep moving. Anyway, lots of history. Don't mean to paper over it. There's a lot that could be said about Mexico prior to Cortez's arrival in 1519, but that's when the Spaniards show up. They find one of the most sophisticated and advanced civilizations in the Americas, if not comparatively globally, even. But given the particularly the arms and the viruses that the Spanish arrived with, the Spanish laid waste to the Aztec Empire in about 3 years. This is and set up their own hierarchical, authoritarian, and militaristic regime. That had a nominal leader in Mexico City, but really was overseen by Madrid back in Europe. This is not to shed tears for the loss of democracy or anything. The Aztec Empire was very hierarchical, authoritarian, and militaristic as well. But that's the story. Independence took some time, good 300 years. Had a lot to do with the fact that, and I believe I've mentioned this once or twice in class, Spain insisted that anyone really in positions of power in the Americas, not just in Mexico, but throughout the Spanish America, if you will, for lack of a better term, insisted that anyone who ruled had to have been born in Spain, right? And this over time, obviously meant oppression for everyone else who wasn't born in Spain. They were second-class citizens. But that came to include the offspring of Spaniards who had come to Mexico. They were also locked out of power because they had not been born in Spain. These were the criollos, right? The wealthy, powerful, white European folks who didn't like the fact that they still had to do everything according to the way Madrid wanted it done. Then came the War of Independence that lasted for over a decade. Mexico became independent in 1821. As I say here, inspired by French and American revolutions. That's true. It also came at a time when Spain was really weak. Napoleon had invaded Spain in 1803, I believe. Napoleon had asked Spain for permission to invade Portugal. Hey, can I march through your country to invade your smaller neighbor? Spain said yes. Napoleon's army stopped in Madrid and took over Spain too. It was a pretty stupid move. But the response to that embarrassment by the French and the loss of most of its colonies by 1820, 1822, Spain took a bit of a progressive turn for the time. And I think it was a way to come to terms with the loss of its empire. But Mexico was left with rule by a bunch of conservative elites, the criollo types, who wanted independence, could sell it to the masses, but really continued the hierarchical authoritarian status quo, right? So independence did not bring about a great change in particularly how poor people lived in Mexico at the time, right? Because it was dominated by the criollo conservatives. There you go, right? Mexico's indigenous and mestizo populations really didn't benefit, right? What we mean by mestizo, these are Mexicans of mixed European and indigenous descent. This is the majority of the population. We'll come back to this in a sec when we get to the society bit of the slides. I'll have something to say about that. Fast forward a few decades, and you get to the Mexican-American War, which, if you went to high school in Texas, I'm sure you learned more about than most of us did who went to high school outside of Texas and outside of the United States for a bit. But James K. Polk basically amassed troops along the border, which was at the time the western edge of the territory purchased in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, and pretty much provoked Mexico's military into attacking the U.S. troops massed along the border. The U.S. called it an invasion, then in turn invaded Mexico and took over about a third of the territory that belonged to Mexico at the time, which had been part of New Spain, which includes a lot of territory in the Southwest, including where we are today. Following the defeat, the government was weakened and faced a popular uprising of indigenous and poor people. That's called the War of the Castes. Not maybe the best term we should use today, but it sparked a trend, right? The 19th century, in particular, into the 20th century, saw much tension between the haves and the have-nots. And the haves were overwhelmingly ethnically white Europeans, although Mexican citizens, in conflict, bloody and otherwise, with, again, the poor, mestizo, and indigenous populations, right? This leads to the Mexican Revolution, which was in effect a civil war that culminated in a democracy, yes, a constitutional regime, yes, um, that mirrored, and we'll get to this in a bit, the institutional structure of the United States. But it also saw the birth of the PRI regime, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the revolutionary, institutional revolutionary party. I don't know, that's a bad translation, but it's an awkward name of sorts. I'll just call it the PRI from here on out with my endearing Midwestern accent, the PRI. But again, the revolution was a class struggle in effect, if you will. And it's still there. We'll talk about this throughout here. Stability achieved, yes. The pretty much takes over the system by 1929. On paper, Mexico is a democracy by now, by this point. There were regular elections, there were transfer of power from one person to another, but they were always of the same party. But the military didn't get involved. There was really rarely violence. Opposition parties were allowed to compete, they just never won. So again, this is somewhere in between, call it Japan and China, in terms of the connection between state and party power, right? Again, trappings of democracy, free speech, free press, etc. But elections weren't always fair. Again, the same party held power for over 70 years. There were no open primaries. Presidents basically just designated their successors. The term for this is el dedazo, in my goofy Mexican sounding Spanish. The big finger is how you would translate that. But it was one president pointing at the next guy saying, hey, you, and you're not seeing my finger pointing, you're the next candidate, which is in effect declaring the person the next president, right? The used the party machinery and thus, the state to dispense patronage, in effect buying support from the wealthy, who could trickle down with clientelism to get support, buy support from those down the hierarchy. And then we'll get to the example of major electoral fraud in 1988 in a bit. I got that in a point that'll come up. But during these years, since there was in effect unified government for most of the time, the PRI also controlled the legislative branch, the Congress. The president really had very little checks on power. So, had a lot of control over the economy, and by extension, society, and occasionally would use repression against protesters. So, particularly in 1968, the film Roma, if you've seen that, it's a quite good one. It's not about Italy, it's about Mexico, Mexico City in particular. It's a neighborhood in Mexico City. Came out maybe 2018. I recommend that one if you want to learn a little more about the subtleties of overt political oppression in Mexico in the late 1960s. Looking at the regime, I said before, the Constitution, like most Latin American constitutions, follows the U.S. Constitution with a presidential system, separation of powers. This is also a large country, so it makes sense that it would be a federal state as well. But again, the PRI's domination of the system really meant that the Constitution was, a guide at best of how to rule the country, and presidents were pretty free to do what they wanted. And I'll mention this later, but since presidents under the Constitution only serve one 6-year term, you don't have to worry about re-election. So if you don't have to worry about Congress, you don't have to worry about re-election. You get to pick your successor to clean up your mess. It allowed presidents to really do whatever the hell they wanted, right? So how did how did that monopoly break? Economic crisis. Voters had enough. This is also a country that depends heavily on oil, produces a lot of oil. The 70s were not good for Mexico because of oil crisis. The 80s were not good for Mexico because of oil crisis and overspending and inflation, which hurt the peso, et cetera, et cetera. The latter bit of the 20th century, despite an uptick in the economy after Mexico joined NAFTA in 1994, really created a lot of frustration and opened a path for opposition parties to challenge the PRI. And again, I alluded to this a minute ago. I'll go into detail in a bit. But in 1988, the PRI basically just robbed the electorate and the country of a transparent presidential election, and that festered. So by the year 2000, the PRI's monopoly broke. But anyway, we're still talking about the system itself in broad strokes here. Presidents, again, pretty much, semi-dictatorial, elected monarchs, whatever you want to call them. Presidents can issue executive decrees, sort of like executive orders in the United States. They can directly introduce legislation, which U.S. presidents can't. They can veto legislation, which many presidents can. Presidents serve 6-year terms, but only one of them, which I mentioned a minute ago, which limits power in a way, but I think it also can exacerbate it in negative ways, right? Again, you don't have to worry about re-election. You don't really have to worry about what comes next. In the long term, it's difficult to say, since the revolution, who the greatest Mexican presidents have been. Not in a way we could make a list of the best U.S. presidents, because none of them really have done great things. I don't think history remembers any particular Mexican president fondly. But anyway, and I think that's in part a consequence of the PRI's monopoly and just the system itself with single terms. Here's one of these charts here. We get the lines of control from this textbook. You see the electorate here votes for Congress, votes for the president. This looks very simplistic. It also doesn't mention the judiciary at all. I dwell on these sometimes. This one I'm going to skip over because of its simplicity, but I will show you a similar I don't know how I want to use not a derogatory term, but an inappropriate term. Here, evidence the mental masturbation of some authors of a different comparative textbook that I've taught from before. This gives you a little different view, right? It should also serve to make you think that these little figures that I put in, or that the textbook includes, maybe aren't always as wonderful as the authors perhaps think. You see that voters vote for a lot of folks, right? Local elections, state elections, national elections, etc. Direct election of the president, direct election of both chambers of Congress. I think that's a good thing. I don't know enough about the judicial branch to explain what's going on the far right. Like the U.S. system, at the very least, we see that the president nominates the Supreme Court, members of the Supreme Court. The Senate confirms these folks. The Supreme Court then has the authority to nominate the Electoral Court, which is confirmed by the Senate. So, there are lots of other arrows we could add to this structure of government and the flow of power. But again, I guess I'll suffice it to say, as I try to move quickly here, this is very much a democracy, very much as a system that mirrors the United States system, for better, for worse. But it's one that hasn't always functioned to plan, right? And again, that has a lot to do with, again, domination of the system by one party for the first 70 years of the existence of the Constitution, more or less. Comparing the two houses of Congress should look pretty familiar here. Chamber of Deputies is analogous to the U.S. House of Representatives. 3-year terms. It used to be that you could only be elected to one term in either chamber, one successive term. You couldn't run for re-election. That's since changed. I'll talk about that in a minute here. But the Chamber of Deputies can do things that the House of Representatives does in the United States. Obviously passes laws, but levies taxes, verifies electoral outcomes, sort of like, Congress tried to do on January 6th of 2021. The Senate represents the states, so 3 from each state and 3 from the federal district of Mexico City. But that doesn't add up to 128. So there are an additional 32 members of the Senate elected from a national proportional representation list. So, functions, again, much more like the United States Senate. However, it does have this parliamentary tinge to it that can allow, it helps to facilitate party control over the system, right? You can directly elect senators, but if, say, during the time of the PRI's monopoly, that was a good way for the opposition to get some experience in leadership, but the proportional representation list also helped the PRI to ensure that it had majorities in the Senate, right? It is the weaker House, but still does things like the U.S. Senate does as well, that you can read there. Again, not dissimilar to what the U.S. Senate does. The structure here, legislators cannot be reelected to consecutive terms, although that has changed in 2012. The Constitution was amended to limit politicians to 4 consecutive terms in the Chamber of Deputies and 2 in the Senate. If we were doing this face to face, we talk about advantages and disadvantages. Advantages might be that you have greater, knowledge of what you're doing. That's when we talk about term limits in the United States. My parents are voters of different parties in the United States, but they're both fans of term limits, and I try to play devil's advocate when I talk to them. There are advantages to doing that, but there are disadvantages as well, right? Because the more time you spend in one of these houses, the more institutional knowledge you gain, right? You could better represent your constituents, arguably, but you could also perhaps, steal more, especially in a system with less and less transparency, right? So, advantages and disadvantages. The legislature was formerly, like the presidency, a monopoly of the PRI, but now, in more recent decades, has been under the control of other parties as well. The electoral system here, past electoral fraud, particularly in 1988. I've alluded to this once before. The PRI, that was the first year Mexico voted with electronic voting machines, which, never caused problems anywhere else, or, allegedly. But in 1988, the PRI basically, the system collapsed. You're not seeing my air quotes. While the PRI candidate was behind, and then it turned out that the PRI candidate had a big lead once the machines came back online, and the people were fed up. So the PRI conceded to pressure and created this Federal Elections Institute to administer elections, ostensibly to increase transparency in the system. And now that Federal Electoral Institute also has a role to play in local elections. So I think in the longer term, this has been a beneficial thing for transparency in elections in Mexico, but again, reluctantly created by the PRI in the late 1980s. Voting in Mexico is compulsory, but this is not always enforced. Turnout is higher than the United States, but lower than a lot of other Latin American countries at around 60%. Again, the president's directly elected by plurality vote, which means there are no runoffs, which has been a bit problematic in recent years. The breaking of the PRI monopoly has introduced a level of instability, electoral instability, that, again, for 70 years prior to 2000 was unknown. But what happens is, since there is no runoff and there's often more than 2 candidates in any given presidential election, whoever wins never has more than 50, rarely has more than 50% of the vote. We'll put it that way, which can lead to immediate questions of legitimacy from the outset of any president's term. Right. Think Bill Clinton in 1996. There were well, you weren't around, but there were 3 candidates for president. There was an effective third party candidate in Ross Perot. and Bill Clinton didn't get more than 30-some% of the vote, which had some people up in arms. But anyway, beside the point. The judiciary in in Mexico is modeled after the United States. Has a constitutional court, state and local courts, etc. Has a Supreme Court, which is the highest court. Has 11 justices as opposed to 9 in the United States. I do like the limiting to 15-year terms. I kind of wish we would do something like this in the United States, but that's another topic for another day. It does have certain power of judicial review, although this takes a request from 1/3 of the lower house. I kind of think that's a nice thing to do. We've talked about this off and on in class, how in the United States it takes someone proving that they've been harmed by the inconstitutionality of a law for a challenge to go through the court system and on the way all the way up to the Supreme Court. This system allows, say, a party in opposition, just 1/3 of the lower house to request judicial review. Right? I kind of wish some countries could learn from other countries on how to do that. Right? But anyway. There we are. Federal versus local. This is a federal system, of course, but it's more limited than comparable federal systems, some of which we've studied already. One we'll study next week, Brazil. The federal government has more power over the states than in other federal systems. Since the return of democracy, air quotes, in 2000, you've seen increased proportion or a portion of government spending delegated to state and local governments. It used to be that Mexico City, the federal district, really had a stranglehold over spending. The federal government collects the money, collects taxes, and then redistributed that money to states. That has increased. That federal monopoly of taxing and spending has decreased over time. However, this arguably has coincided with a tick up in local corruption. Police have been particularly problematic. Some localities, police report or replace federal forces with an attempt to root out corruption, because again, the federal government has been skeptical of ironically the transparency at the state level. So again, back to the why study the case. Transparency has been a long-term concern in this country. This is from the aforementioned previous comparative textbook that I've used in the past, but this gives you an idea from 1988 to 2012, which parties have controlled different state governments, and the red is the PRI, the blue is the PAN party, which gained the presidency in 2000 and again in 2006. It's a more conservative party. I'll talk about it in a minute. The PRD is a progressive party that has been more electorally popular in the southern states and in Mexico City. The current president, AMLO, is an inheritor of the PRD. We'll talk about this in a sec. Here we get to some of the nitty-gritty details about the PRI. Again, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, I guess would be the best translation of this. But as I've alluded to, for 70 years or so, the PRI and its power was indistinguishable from state power, and that's what I said matter-of-factly about the Communist Party in China. The difference is, since this is a democracy, however flawed as all democracies are, that's the way it's been, although that's been broken, right? Initially, the PRI was much more of a leftist party, social democratic party, if you will, under the first PRI president, Lázaro Cárdenas, who really helped get the oil industry off the ground, worked arguably to decrease poverty, spend money in poorer parts of the country. I think he has been remembered well, I guess. I'll say this, contradicting what I said earlier, but if you had to pick, the best president in Mexican history, I think a lot of people would say Cárdenas. However, what came after him really was an abuse of the system by his party. By the 1980s, again, and I would argue going back to the oil crisis in 1973, economic and political crises really would break down the PRI's hegemony of the system, which ended in the year 2000 when Vicente Fox won the presidency. Over time, it's pretty clear the PRI's ideology has been malleable. It really is maybe not so much now in 2023, but for the 20th century is pretty much an authoritarian populist party, right? And today, the PRI is often criticized for either lacking a clear ideology or in practice now functioning almost as a center-right party, which is not how it was founded, right? But, people and parties, I guess, have to adapt to changing political realities. But after 2 terms of PAN leadership from 2000 to 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto, a rather handsome, relatively young president, was elected, bringing about hope and skepticism. Pledged to strengthen democracy, which in the name of the PRI was hard to not snicker at. He had criticized his predecessor's war against the drug cartels, particularly that of I call him Vicente Calderon, but that's not right. Who's the Calderon was the last name of the president from 2006 to 2012. Vicente Calderon is an old stadium in Madrid where Atletico used to play. But Calderon was very much cracked down on drug cartels through violence, which had a lot of external casualties, citizens hurt in the state's crackdown on drug cartels. And Peña Nieto, having criticized that prior to election, pretty much continued the policies once he was in power. He continued the PAN's trend toward greater economic liberalization, which is why, again, those critical of the PRI say, hey, you used to not be so neoliberal, now you are. And it's pretty clear that Peña Nieto in his 6 years didn't do much to improve transparency within the judicial system or reform it. So by 2018, the voters again voted the PRI out of office. This hyperlink here will take you to, if you click on it in the T-Learn, just a short story. It's in Spanish, but on Flag Day in Mexico in 2008, prior to the election, it was a foreshadowing on the Flag Day that year. A massive flag was raised, Mexican flag in Mexico City that was upside down. And I think it's just the irony is that Peña Nieto knew that things weren't going well. And I don't know if this was done intentionally or not. I don't think we'll ever know. But raising the flag of distress there was a great irony. And instead, in 2018, voters elected a leftist president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who often gets called AMLO. I hate all of these acronyms that we do all the bloody time now, but AMLO, he is, had run very much as a leftist. He'd been the mayor of Mexico City. He is still the president of Mexico. I don't see his party winning elections in 2024. But anyway, let's talk about the left and the right broadly. After the revolution, the PRI definitely had leftist phases, and it co-opted policies that were pushed for by parties further left of it, right? So the PRI did a good job of limiting leftist parties' appeals. And again, having to deal with the PAN, the center-right party, would pull the PRI a bit to the right, basically trying to co-opt the best that it could from either of its flanks. But again, back to the party ideologies being malleable. By the 1980s, the PRD, the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, the Party of Democratic Revolution, was formed. This was led by Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, who was the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, or I say was, I don't know if he's still alive, but he was the president or the he wanted to be president. He was the one who ran in 1988, and electoral fraud with the voting machines denied him the presidency. But as you can see, with a name like Cuauhtemoc, he was given a name by his father that was very much, an homage to the mestizo and indigenous peoples of Mexico. If you watch the film Y Tu Mamá También, you'll note that one of the main characters is named Tenoch. Tenochtitlan, right? The Aztec name for Mexico City. And he's also the son of a politician. It's subtle in the film, you got to pay attention to the details. But I think Tenoch, the character in Mi Tu Mamá También, is sort of a loose parody of Cárdenas, the younger. But anyway, I'll come back to the film in a bit. But AMLO, the current president, very much a leftist. He had run for president in 2006 and 2012. 2006, the results were razor thin, to the point that he held his own inauguration ceremony in Mexico City. So while if you have leftist leanings yourself, and you might be critical of former President Trump and how he handled the results of the 2020 election in the United States, here you have a leftist who basically ran his own Stop the Steal campaign in 2006. But ultimately, he understood that he wasn't president. Excuse me, taking a drink. But he had the last word, I suppose, because the failures of the Calderón administration in 2006 to 12 facilitated the reemergence of the PRI in 2012, but the failure of Peña Nieto and the PRI to really live up to expectations opened the door finally for AMLO and his Morena party, which is a spinoff from the PRD to take power, right? He's in a commercial plane here because he famously refused to use the presidential jet, and he flies commercial whenever he needs to move about the country or internationally. Some things, I don't know, if you're against wasteful government spending, there's some things to like about the guy, but he's pretty much a leftist populist. The right in Mexico has always existed, right? The PAN party, the Partido de Acción Nacional, the National Action Party, was founded by PRI defectors in the late 1930s. Not unlike perhaps the Republican Party in the States, there's a division between social conservatives and those who are more of what we call your economic conservatives, who are into free market policies and such. Vicente Fox was the first PAN candidate to win election. You'll see him at the end of the slides here. He was an outsider in the PAN. He had poor relations with the social conservatives, but he had been the head of Coca-Cola in Mexico. So he's very much a business guy. And he did expand the party to appeal to new voters, which I think is no small reason why, despite him perhaps not having accomplished as much as I'm sure even he wanted to in his one term, he did well enough that the PAN won re-election. In the form of what's his face, Calderón, Felipe, that's his name, Felipe Calderón, won in 2006. But the PAN, its electoral heft is concentrated in the industrial north around Monterrey. But again, the South is poor, more indigenous, and more of pre-territory still to this day. But again, I've said this a few times, Fox failed to live up to the high expectations of his victory. He found it difficult to work with the opposition-led legislature, the pre-legislature, and his successor, Felipe Calderón, delivered mixed results. His crackdown on the drug cartels was not viewed very favorably, I think. By 2012, the PAN ran Mexico's first woman presidential candidate. She did not do well, and that's when Enrique Peña Nieto won the election, right? And then in 2018, nobody did well other than AMLO. But other parties do exist. They often find their way into the legislature. Perhaps the most important one is the Green Party, which the text is pretty critical of. It's the authors of our textbook call it an opportunist party. It is pretty certain that it is not your traditional environmental party. It doesn't really line up with green parties that we see, particularly in Europe. But it's a third party of note nonetheless. And who knows, in the medium term, it might eventually become more of a player, as all three of the major parties, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD, have really suffered in recent years. And as we've discussed in other contexts, like in France, I mean, when you see parties come and go, and parties out of nowhere win elections, and new parties win elections at the highest level, it's not indicative of great political stability here, right? And here are the results of the 2018 election. There were coalitions formed of sorts, and granted, this is not a parliamentary system, but the Juntos Haremos Historia call it the leftist coalition of Morena and minor parties. The Por Mexico al Frente, the more conservative coalition led by the PAN. But you can see in the presidential vote on the right-hand side here, this is really noteworthy, where you have, pretty much a three-way race. In recent presidential cycles in Mexico, the three-way race really ended up with the party, or the vote split a third, more or less. And Morena under AMLO really cleaned up in 2018. And I think, again, that's a sign of voters' frustration with the two traditional parties. However, I don't know, if I had to bet today, I would not put money on the Morena candidate winning the election in 2024. But what do I know? I'm just a political science professor. But as we move to talking about society here, and I'm trying to go fast, and I'm not doing a great job of it. Ethnic groups, right? The majority of the population has some indigenous descent. You see the majority of the population is of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent. At 62%, over a quarter is predominantly indigenous, with about 10% being mostly European. This is why when I hear people say, "Oh, I'm Mexican," I say, "Well, do you have a Mexican passport?" No. Okay. So what do you mean by that, right? Because there is no one ethnic identity to associate with the term Mexican, as if one claims it as an ethnic marker, right? This is the difference between state identity and ethnic identity, right? I don't like it when people talk about Mexicans in general to just assume, like my racist uncle would. I have no idea what they're talking about when they say that, right? What are you referring to, right? But again, this is just Larson back on his soapbox about the importance of using terms correctly, right? But there we are. This was why when we talked about state and nation at the beginning of the semester, I pulled up some photos of my very pregnant wife and I in Mexico City last September, with the discussion of, do we embrace our Aztec heritage? Do we embrace our Mexican heritage? No, what we need to do is embrace a Mexican identity under the banner of the state to bring us together, right? Religiously speaking, Mexico is very Roman Catholic. That's not to say 83% of the population goes to church every Sunday. That's definitely not true. But it is and does not cease to be a state in which the Catholic Church, and again, although the state is nominally secular, the church still has a lot of political, social, cultural weight. But again, back to this ethnic and national identity, the PRI very much sought to blend cultures, right, under the banner of mestizaje, which is, again, blending of cultures, as I say here. But indigenous peoples have not been assimilated into state and culture very well, much less the highest levels of political power. On the contrary, they've been very marginalized. Many live in poverty. If you watch the film, if you've seen the film, Y tu mamá también, or if you watch it again, note particularly the narrator. The narrator of the film will point out in numerous moments how and why those particularly in rural areas, but also within Mexico City, um, have suffered. They live in poverty and they suffer because of how the state is structured, and how the society treats indigenous peoples within the system. So pay attention to the narrator, right? I'm not going to go much into detail about the Zapatistas, but concentrated in the South, particularly in Chiapas, have since the mid 1990s, in response to NAFTA, uh, advocated for greater political reform and rights for indigenous peoples. Um, but anyway, another reason perhaps why the priest dominance was broken by the year 2000. Anyway, ideology and political culture. This is a society in which people, for all the things I've discussed up to now and everything you've read in the textbook, are profoundly distrustful of the state. Right. Many, according to lots of surveys, many Mexicans express little or no interest in politics, and this is logical when the government has doesn't respond well to national crises. Corruption, lack of transparency, political scandals abound, and you have a system that traditionally was in practice authoritarian, and co-opted people to limit popular participation in the system. So a lot of reasons to be distrustful of any government, left, right, or center, in Mexico, right? Because that's just what history has taught us to understand. We're nearing the end here, thinking about political economy. The revolution was meant to be more inclusive, particularly of the poor and the indigenous rural pockets, which is most of the country, but while at the same time cultivating economic growth, right, which is point number 2 of why to study the case. It's an interesting case to consider. Capitalism is obviously a thing. In Mexico, it's a thing everywhere, even if it's only in a black market in North Korea. But the state has always had a strong role in the economy. Part of the economic woes suffered in the 70s and 80s in Mexico had a lot to do with failed import substitution industrialization, which I've talked about. That was completely done away with, particularly by the time NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, came into force in 1994. That brought in a lot of foreign investment, particularly from the United States, lesser so from Canada, and led to a manufacturing boom, particularly in the north of the country, right? The PAN very much embraced this neoliberal model that took off under the pre-leadership at the twilight of its 70-year rule, and Peña Nieto, the last pre-president, pretty much followed the same. If we look at the economy by sector here, this clearly is not European level development, but it's pretty good, right? You've got a sizable agricultural sector because you've got a lot of arable land, right? And agriculture is a thing in Mexico, very much so. Industry has boomed in recent decades, and a large service sector that continues to grow is indicative of the economic development that the country has seen over the last, say, 40 years or so. Mexico is increasingly more industrialized, urban, and educated, but in a lot of ways, still highly dependent on the United States and its economy, right? To export goods to the United States. The wealthy who can will come for the United States for education, so on and so forth. And then obviously the migration is still very much a reality. I'll talk about that toward the end. I don't want to open that can of worms now. I want to keep moving. Let's think about stay on the economy, Larson. But again, crises, I've mentioned this more than several times now. Economic crises really, I think, perpetuated the downfall of the monopolization of the system, right? By the 1970s, it was difficult to use oil wealth to support massive government spending. It was easy to do that. There's an economic oil crisis in the 1970s, had to do with a war in the Middle East involving Israel, but a lot of OPEC countries decided to stop producing. It drove up the price of oil, which was good for Mexico in the short term, but it led the state to spend a boatload of money that ended up spiking inflation and eroding the value of the peso, right? So that pretty much set the stage for a drop in oil prices, because what goes up must come down. And you see the resource curves play out, and really led to an implosion of the economy in Mexico, which then led the state to turn to borrowing money from foreign entities, which really is, and then led to a debt that's been difficult to service and hurt the economy greatly, right? The response to that was joining NAFTA, which really expanded manufacturing. I just mentioned this, helped to diversify the economy. So we could talk about the virtues of manufacturing in Mexico and exporting to the United States and Canada. But the flip side of that coin was that the other countries in this agreement, Canada and the United States, both have pretty important ag sectors themselves and can produce things more efficiently, more cheaply, agriculture goods, which really hurt rural parts of Mexico where agriculture is still very much the economic driver. Right, look at the state of Zacatecas, right in the middle of the country, the last state in Mexico to get a McDonald's. NAFTA has not been good for people there. More things to consider here. Economic poverty and inequality is still very much a reality. The middle class in Mexico has boomed in recent decades. Poverty on the whole is on the decline, but this is still one of the most unequal countries in one of the most unequal regions in the world, right? And I'd say region, we could limit it to Latin America. We could include the Americas, really, with Canada being the only one that isn't as unequal as just about everywhere else in this side of the globe. Thus, it should not be a surprise Mexico has a large informal economy. I don't know as a percentage what it is, but if you ever have been to Mexico, you see the informal economy at work. I don't need to explain what that is. Peña Nieto sought to change the oil industry to break the Pemex, that's the national oil company, the monopoly, bring in foreign investment. Pemex has traditionally been very inefficient in extracting oil. A lot of money wasted in the process, arguably because of the strength of a strong labor union that fought greater moves to efficiency. But I think this is part of the reason, too, that Peña Nieto is not going to be remembered well by history or in the minds of many voters because of what he did with Pemex. But anyway, despite these challenges, like I said, the middle class has grown rapidly to the point that roughly half of the population could be considered middle class. So here we go. I'm about to wrap up current issues. Some of these we've touched on. I'd be remiss if we didn't say anything else about the drug war. I blame us, right? It's the growing U.S. drug market, and as we see more states within the United States say legalize the production and consumption of cannabis, might be great. Maybe that's your thing. It just means that now the drug cartels are importing and exporting more dangerous drugs, because we still take those in the United States, right? And this does nothing to ameliorate the problems of a lack of transparency and of corruption, right? Drug cartels are well-funded, heavily armed with U.S. arms, and have a symbiotic relationship, particularly with local police and state governments. And that's not good for growth, stability, foreign investment, or for people. Here's the homicide rate in Mexico per 100,000 of the population from 1995 to 2015. At its highest point toward the height of Calderon's crackdown on the drug cartel, saw 25 deaths per 100,000 people. In the United States, with all the gun violence we have, it's usually between 5 and 6 any given year. People out of every 100,000 in the United States die by gun violence. And around a decade ago, that was 5 times higher in Mexico, right? So this is a real thing, right? One of my closest friends is from Mexico, from Toluca. For some reason, Toluca has been sort of neutral ground and hasn't suffered very as much as other states toward the north of the country in the last couple of decades. But if you have a friend who you can really talk to about this, you'll hear stories of people affected by this violence. Got to mention migration. I think I have 2 slides left, this one and one more. Migration from Mexico to the United States, continuously strained relations, but the United States needs it. Now's not the time or place for me to ramble on about how crappily we understand migration to this country, particularly from Mexico, or how the assumptions about migration from Mexico impede us understanding other realities of migration in the United States. But the United States nonetheless has relied on Mexico for cheap labor. We know this to the point that the Bracero program was instituted after World War II by the U.S. government to bring in temporary migration farm workers. Bracero is it's like the arm program, and brazo, right, the arm, to harvest fruit and leave. However, and I think I've mentioned in class at Timer 3, no labor migration system, guest migrant system has ever worked to plan. People stay, right? And so the increase in undocumented migrants had its start with the Bracero program, really, right? Because if you overstay your permission, then you become undocumented, right? This has led the United States over time to toughen immigration laws, strengthen the border. You might recall a recent president wanting to build a wall, but none of these things actually work that well. And this Immigration Reform and Control Act was signed under the Reagan administration. It included an amnesty for millions of undocumented people residing in the United States. So again, when we hear our Republican friends talk about how Democrats want to, use amnesty to welcome these people and turn them into voters, blah, blah, blah. I've had students in California tell me that, yeah, my parents are straight ticket Republican voters because, grandpa received amnesty under the Reagan administration. So again, know your history when you talk about such things that are so important to everyone's life and our economy in this country. But anyway, recent develops in U.S.-Mexico migration. Credit where it's due. George W. Bush, for all of his dumb decisions in other areas, really did seek to get Congress to work together to come about with some bipartisan effective reforms to migration. George Bush famously, before 9/11, really wanted to cultivate better ties with Mexico and Latin America more broadly. The September 11th attacks obviously changed that. And it was in his second term where he then came back to advocating for migration reform, but that failed due to political polarization, as it did with Obama. 8 years of Obama's leadership never really brought about any effective change to the legalities of migration, et cetera, et cetera. However, by 2011, migration from Mexico drops. And that has a lot to do, I've mentioned this in class, right? The economic downturn in the United States also affected Mexico, but people don't migrate to places where they can't work, legally or illegally, right? So the Great Depression, well, not the Great Depression, but the economic downturn of 2008 and beyond coincided with a time where we found more migrants coming to the United States from Asia than from Latin America in its entirety, right? And today, 2023, the real debate isn't over Mexican citizens migrating over the land border into the United States, but people from other parts of the world, right? Throughout Latin America. And even, we see news stories about Russians and Ukrainians now trying to migrate illegally into the United States or try to enter and request asylum, which isn't illegal to do, by the way. But obviously Trump's border wall proposal just really increased tensions with Mexican leaders. Trump famously went to Mexico City to meet with Peña Nieto when he was still a candidate. And it was kind of a joke. And I think that was another reason why, history will not remember Peña Nieto very well. This hyperlink will take you to a John Oliver discussion of the border wall. I don't know if it's really worth your time in terms of content, but it's hilarious. Watch it if you like. And even funnier than that is this second link here. Former President Fox had a colorful message for Trump. He famously said, and this is on YouTube, Mexico will not pay for your effing wall. It's quite good. AMLO was a vocal opponent of Trump's policies, but during his presidency, several years of which coincided with Trump's, basically pursued a non-confrontational approach. And as long as you don't say bad things about Trump, then he, likely won't say bad things about you. So relations with Mexico did not sour as much as I thought they would when AMLO became president. But again, we'll see what the future holds. AMLO's got one more year in his term, and I have absolutely no idea what comes next. But anyway, I'm done. Sorry about the time, as usual, but and I'm sorry again about today. I'll see you Monday. Ciao.